Chapter 9. The Silurian Wars with Rome. They saw their beloved isle invaded, torn, and despoiled by men whose desire was to loot it of its treasure of gold and pearls. Lewis Spence. In the long wars with Rome, the predominant opponents were those known, in such recorded history as exists, as Silures, who were actually Jewish people, known also to the Greeks as Illyrians, and whose ill-fated courage and resistance persisted for over 200 years, until finally they were expelled from their city of Jerusalem, and this period by tradition is AD 66. It is convenient, however, to first appraise their near neighbors and close allies, the Brigantes, the people of Alba, who were originally Trojans or Phrygians, and who settled in Scotland, in a part of Ireland, and on the Isle of Man. 210 Geoffrey of Monmouth claims them as the paramount race in Britain and the ancestors of the later Romans. He states that when Caesar espied the shores of Britain from the coast of Flanders and learnt the name of its people, he exclaimed, "By Hercules, we Romans and these Britons be of one ancestry, for we also are of Trojan stock." Records definitely point to a Trojan settlement and that the name Britain was derived from Brutus, though this claim is somewhat dubious. The Welsh triads declare that of the three pillars of the nation, the first was Hu Gadarn, who led the Cymry first to the isle, the second was Pridan, son of Ede, the Great, Aeneas, who first organized a social state and sovereignty in Britain, the third was Dwywel Malmud, who first made the laws, maxims, customs and privileges of the country and tribe, otherwise Dunwallo, king of Cornwall, who established the Mamutan laws. Pridan is another name for Brutus in the above description. 210 They mainly selected the more fertile regions which had not been decimated by the great catastrophe. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Bretwallas are mentioned as the earliest inhabitants of Bretagne except for the Picts and Scots. Originally they were called Wheelas, signifying strangers. 211 These records relate to their occupation of part of Britain not long after the great catastrophe. An instructive sidelight on Brutus and the Trojans of Alba or Albion, as their territories were named, is contained in a quaint poem of the Dalriads, erst descendants of the Argives, who ruled in Ulster and part of Argyll and the Hebridean Isles, and who appear to have been descendants of the original Danai or Dadanan. The verse says this: "Ye learned of all Alban. Ye wise, yellow-haired race. Learn who first acquired the districts of Alban. Albanus acquired them with all his race. Illustrious son of Aegiocon, Ascanius. Brother to Brutus without treachery. From him Alban of ships takes his name. Brutus expelled his intrepid brother over the sea of Ict. Brutus acquired illustrious Alban to the lands of Fiocnach Fotherdane. 212. The lands of Fiocnach Fotherdane are identified by Waddell as the Ottadini lands, Fothergane, the counties of Roxborough and Berwick, adjoining Galloway and Dumfries. The motive of the verse is to accuse Brutus of having usurped the throne of Alba by treachery from Albanus, son of Ascanius, and of having driven him across the Sea of Ict, Pict or North Sea. This poem is of additional interest because its writer knows of no other Alba apart from the settlement of the Albanians, who traditionally under the aegis of Ascanius built Alba Longa, and whose descendants far later emigrated and became the founders of Rome. 211 Watmore, Insulae Britannicae. Britain, the key to world history. 212 Waddell, Phoenician origins etc. It should also be observed that the Roman writers fail to recognize Brutus, the Pridaean of the Triads, but they do agree that Aeneas was the parent of Ascanius, whose son was forced to flee and sacrifice his rights according to the Dalriad recital. Ascanius, in turn, was succeeded at Alba Longa by his son Alba Silvius, accorded the name of Silvius because he was born in sight of Silva, the forest. It must be realized from the foregoing that these events occurred not in a Greece in the Mediterranean, but in the region of Perthshire, of Fife and of Stirling, adjacent to the boundaries of Edinburgh, and that they included as well Lanarkshire, and southwestern Scotland, from the Clyde to the Solway Firth, with the possible exception of Ayrshire. In tiny Clackmannan, which occupies a slice of Fifeshire, stands the ancient town of Alva to this day, adjoining the former vast Caledonian forest, which Hector Boece, the medieval Scots historian, states began in the neighborhood of Stirling, 7 miles from Alva, and stretched to the very north of Caledonia, mostly impenetrable, and the lair of many savage beasts of old times, including the mammoth, lions, immense horned white aurochs, wild boar, elk, and other herds of deer, as well as wolves. Here is the Silva, and beyond are the Breedalbana Mountains, their name derived from Alban or Alba. Nennius, an early historian, after stating that the British kings of Alba called their dynasty after Silvius, continues. Brutus subdivided the land of Britain, whose inhabitants were the descendants of the Trojans, from Silvius Posthumus, whose mother was Lavinia. He was called Silvius, from whom the kings of Alva were called Silvan. He was the brother to Brutus. Posthumus reigned among the Latins. 213. In the ancient Scottish Chronicle and the De Situ Albanii, Alba, Albania, or Albany was described as extending from Mons Drum Alban, Breedalbany, to the Mare Hibernii, Irish Sea, and Inchgall, Galloway, the Rins of Galloway being Inch, the isle or peninsula of the Gauls, Ritson's Annals 2, 25. Another version describes the Kingdom of Albany as beyond Breedalbany to Inchgall and Track Muir, Solway Firth. 214. These records confirm. 213. Nennius, History of the Ancient Britons, pp 10-11. 214. Watmore, Insulae Britannicae. One another that the original territories of the Trojans stretched from the Breedalbana Mountains in Perthshire to the Solway Firth, though they did not include the eastern lowlands, the Lothians, Haddington, Peebles, Selkirk, Roxburgh, or Berwick. Albany was also known, for reasons to be given, as Regium, after the original name borne by Galloway and Dumfries. The history of the Trojans, who they were racially, where they originally dwelt, and whither they migrated on a large scale after the fall of Troy, has been entirely misrepresented owing to the orthodox teaching that they were Asiatics from the coast of Asia Minor. The fact that they migrated almost bodily, or at least in large numbers, to Britain and Ireland, at a period after the Great Catastrophe, when there were great vacant open spaces awaiting inhabitants, should alone have caused historians to pause. The Trojans, who were racially Phrygians, lived nowhere near the Mediterranean, and Troy was never built on the coast or even in the region of Asia. They were a robust Nordic people, yellow-haired as says the Dalraic poem, and northern in all their characteristics. Virgil, in the Aeneid, mentions that they shook hands with one another, a custom entirely alien to Asiatics whose ancient method is the salam. They raised funeral mounds or barrows, as were customary in the north, along with cromlechs, dolmens etc., but entirely lacking in the Mediterranean east of Italy or in any part of Asia Minor or Asia generally. 215. The real Phrygia extended from the Danish peninsula west of the river Elbe, and along the coasts of Hanover and the Low Countries, which later formed the state of Frisia, made so powerful under Charlemagne the Great. They called themselves Franks there, otherwise Gauls, and claimed descent from the original Trojans, or Assyrians. All this was part of Asia, a name derived from the Aryan root as, signifying a divine being, godlike. 216. According to Scandinavian traditions, Troy lay in the heart of this conception, for Odin, who had so many names, after conquering the north with 215. Ralston, pp 52-3. Barrows, dolmens, and cromlechs lie west of a line from Vernger Fjord to the mouth of the Rhone. A few are found in Tuscany, but the Etruscans came from Britain. 216. Paul B. du Caylus, The Viking Age, I, p. 27. His armed followers, the Asar, known as Asarmen, gave that name to the entire region. From Asgard, the Scandinavian name for Ur, he appointed rulers, who met on the high plain of Idavel, in the center of the divine city where he erected a temple of gold with 12 thrones. 217. We are told in the Prose Edda that Odin was king of Troy, and according to Du Caylus, it was the Troja of the later Edda, built by the sons of Bor, who raised altar and temples on Idavel. 218. The legends all point irrevocably to the north of Europe and nowhere bear Asia as their habitation. Fundamentally they were Saxons, according to the scriptures, Assyrians, but Trojans and Assyrians were identical, originating from Babylon. Homer, for his part, gives us a definite clue to the site of Troy. In the Iliad he describes the Phrygians by the Hellespont as from far Ascania's lake with Phorcys joined. 2:19 The two extremes were joined by the sea, he implies, from Ascania's lake to that where stood Phorcys. Now, Phorcys was otherwise Orcus, the underworld of the Uranid pantheon, a magical, antediluvian underworld, in which Phorcys was an Atlantean demigod, or demon, who was reputed to carry off men, but not women, to the lower world, and keep them imprisoned there. There is little doubt but that it related to the mysteries of Cabiri magic, and was a myth pertaining to subterranean temples used for initiation rites closely concerned with the Cabiri deities whose heart or center from the earliest days lay in Ur of the Chaldees, or Samothrace. Such a possible temple is the still existent chambered subterranean edifice at Moshow, near the stones of Stennis, in Orkney. 224c, son of Oceanus and Gaea, the earth, was the eponymous parent of the Gorgons and Graea, the first being notorious witches with serpents for hair, and the Graea, 3 grey-haired crones, who possessed but one tooth among the 3 of them. Both are hyperbolic descriptions of aged druidesses, who were prominent in the matter of magic. They related definitely to Orkney. 217 Ibid, I, pp 44-61. 218 Ibid, I, p. 45. 219 Homer, Trans Derby, 2, 999-1000. 220 The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain. Moses, as Zalmoxis, escaped to Ur, where he retired into cavernous places inaccessible to others. Also see Strabo, Geography, 7, 3, 5, and Herodotus, 4, 94-6. Phorcys, also parent of Laodan, who guarded the golden apples of the Hesperides, a myth closely wrapped up with the tree of knowledge and the serpent, all relating to the production of magic, was also Orcus or Orshu or Orkney. Therefore, Homer, in naming him as representing Orkney at one extremity of the sea, gives Ascania's lake, as the other extremity, as being the home of the Phrygian people. Denmark's early name was Scania or Scania, the origin of Scandinavia, widened since to include Norway and Sweden. The sea off the Danish shores and Hanover was the original Hellespont of the Greeks, the Sea of Hellas, and today the name is, probably, preserved in the little island of Heligoland and Heligoland Bay. Its very name is strange and may signify I go to the land of Hell, otherwise referring to Scotland. Here, at any rate, was the other extreme from Phorcys or Orkney, where stood Troy. Josephus throws an interesting light on the situation in his identification of the Phrygians, who were, he says, descendants of Japheth, sons of Gomer, the founder traditionally of the Cimmerians, or Galatai/Ae. Of the 3 sons of Gomer, Astyanax founded the Astyanaxians, who are now called by the Greeks Rhaginians. So did Riphaith found the Riphians, now called Paphlagonians, and through Gramma the Thrugrammens, who, as the Greeks resolved, were named Phrygians. 221. The Bible name for Ascanians or Astyanaxians is Ashkenaz, long a puzzle to classic and biblical writers, for, as Sir William Smith admits in his classical dictionary, Ascania or Ashkenaz was related to Scandinavia, and yet in common with other peoples supposedly Asiatic, is ascribed to the region of a small freshwater lake in Asia Minor. Many of the names associated with the supposed region of the Troad, such as Mysia, the Morni, Tithrania, Pergamus, and Phrygia itself, placed arbitrarily in Asia, may be retraced in northern Europe, near the Baltic Sea, within the regions of Odin-Zasar. Hellespontine Phrygia was where is now Schleswig-Holstein, and Phrygia proper embraced the 221 Josephus, Antiquities, I, 6, 1. Lands west of the Albis River, the Greek Halys, now the Elbe, a region which, as stated, in the time of Charlemagne, was named Frisia, a slight variation of Phrygia. And there stood Troy. With Ascania, otherwise Scandia, a few words may be said about Ilium or Troy, traditionally founded by Tugger and Scamander, both Aeolids of Crete, Shetland, who took the worship of Apollo Smintheus with them, and hence the gods assumed partiality for the Trojans in the war with Agamemnon and the Greeks. The claim made by the German Schliemann in the 19th century to have discovered the ruins of Troy at Hissarlik was, like many such, based more on caprice than any proofs, for having discovered ruins at that place, he decided they were those of Troy. 222 We may understand better from the geographical connection, from place names of contiguous sites, and other factors, that when it was said that Troy was a daughter of Crete, and we are aware that Crete was the original Shetland Orkney Island, how it came to be established in the region of Ascania, which gave its name to Trojan Ascanius, just as it gave Scandinavia its name. It is moreover in agreement with the situation as reconstructed, that Odin, whose invasion in the north of Europe created immense turmoil in a prehistoric period, gave the name Asia to these regions, and according to the Prose Edda, was king of Troy, also that the later Edda says that Troy was built by the sons of Bor, or Bur, who raised altars and temples on the Idavel, for the sons of Bor, the Boraids, or sons of Eber, or Eber, were the original Cretans, whose great city was Ur or Bor. In other words, the Trojans were racially Galati or Gauls from northern Scotland. Thomas Baxter, the learned 18th century antiquarian, described the Phrygians as those who became masters of all Western Europe. They used, says he, the name of Bruges, or Phrygs, and he claimed that the Brigantes of Britain were of that same race. He related them to the Phoenicians, Chaldeans, and says that they 222 ed. Note, it is worthy of remark that the boys of Wales still amuse themselves by cutting out 7 enclosures in the sward, which they call the city of Troy, and dance round and between them as if in imitation of the revolution of the planets. W. Winwood Reade, The Veil of Isis, 3, Analysis. Called themselves Britons, or Britanni. 223 They also claimed descent from Gad, which must finally establish their origin as from northern Britain in a long prehistoric period. As to this, Herodotus is helpful. According to him, the Phrygians claimed to be the oldest civilized people, but the Bryges of Thrace and Macedonia took exception to this boast and declared that the Phrygians were descendants of theirs and took the names of Phryges later. 224 In fact, Bryges, Phryges, Phrygs, or Phryzes, vary only in the slightest degree, due probably to a provincial colloquialism often found in proper names. The Phrygians or Trojans intermixed with the existing British population as one of themselves, and do not appear as aliens in their history. Nor should they. Exactly where Troy stood is necessarily speculative, for it was largely destroyed by the great catastrophe shortly after its fall, and does not appear from records to have been rebuilt in the classic ages. On the Elbe, however, the earlier Albes, stands the very ancient city of Hamburg, whose name portends a city of Ham, or Ammon, or Gad, with its port at the mouth of the river Cuxhaven, which suggests the haven of Cush. The modern Hamburg owes its foundation to Charlemagne, who erected a citadel and a church on the heights between the eastern bank of the river Alster, a height that may have been the site of the ancient Mount Ida, but only close archaeological research could discover if any evidence yet exists. It is worth recalling that the Trojans who migrated to Britain at once named their city Alba and termed themselves Albans, indicating a former connection with the Albes. I shall venture one other item relating to Phrygia. Herodotus relates how some Mysians and Teucrians, named after Teucer, one of the 2 traditional founders of Troy, invaded Hellas from Phrygia and proceeded to the river Peneus and the Ionian Sea after crossing the Bosporus, landing in Thrace. 225 This is quite explicable. They passed through Denmark, crossed by the short passage to Norway, then by boat. 223 Thomas Baxter, Glossary of the Antiquities of Britain, p. 48. 224 Herodotus, 2, 129. 225 Herodotus, 7, 20. Reached a port in Caledonia, where they made their way through the chain of lochs, from Loch Ness, to the mouth of Loch Linhi. In Mysia dwelt the Teucthranes or Teuthranes, descendants of Teucer, described by Caesar as Teuchthani or Teuchthri, both incorrect but identifying the people who were settled, he says, at the confluence of the Mosa, Meuse, and Rhine. 226 The Meuse derived its name from Mysia, a variation of Moses. A city of considerable importance in the city of Mysia was Pergamus, celebrated for its fabrics, arts, and learning, while off the coast lay a number of isles which correspond with the Frisian Isles. Pergamus was a pagan cathedral city, and a university, and was the royal residence of kings. Here Dionysus, Aphrodite, and Aesculapius were all worshipped, and in one of its temples was the throne of Satan. It became an early seat of Christianity, one of the 7 churches of Asia. The Pergamene king Attalus III made the Romans his heirs in 133 BC, and there they planted a colonia in AD 51, which city is now Cologne. Mysia was a widely spread region but not a state. To return to the Trojans in Britain. Although Josephus says that the Ascanians, Ascanacs, were called Ragonians by the Greeks, he does not explain why. The reason is that the bulk of them from the river Albis to Bruges, originally in Phrygia, or Frisia, settled in Rhegium, then a part of Grycia Magna, and later named Brutium, after Brutus. Now, this Rhegium was that very same part of Britain as set out by the Dalriads, already described as in the peninsula of Wigtonshire in the western lowlands, called the Rins of Galloway, with Dumfries, Kirkcudbright, and perhaps Ayr as their territories. It obtained the name of Rhegium because it was known as Rhaeg to the ancient Britons. In the days of King Arthur, Sir Owen, one of his far-famed knights, was the son of Urien, Prince of Rhaeg, sometimes given the title of King. 227 It seems possible that Brutus himself left Alva or Alba to Silvius Alba and retained the lands of Rhegium from the Clyde to the Solway Firth, the actual Albany, which became later the Kingdom of Strathclyde, and 226 Caesar, Commentaries on the Gallic War, 4:15. Many Roman writers besides Caesar were careless with their spelling of proper names. 227 Mabinogion, trans Lady Charlotte Guest, pp 353-8. To this day is a royal dukedom. However, as late as AD 496, according to the ancient Scottish Chronicle and the De Situ Albanii, King Fergus Mac reigned from Mons Drum Alban to the Mer Hibernii et Inch Gaul, Irish Sea and Galloway. Drum Alban lay south of Glen Mork nan Alban, the Great Valley of Alban, the Caledonian line of lochs from Moray Firth mentioned as the farthest limit. Thus the kingdom of Fergus extended over Perthshire, and according to one account, held apart with the tribe Dalriada, cum gentes Dalriada partes Britanniae. The Albians or Albanians appear in the Welsh annals as late as 1085 and 1091, Albanwiv and Albaniete, and Watmore asserts that the native Scots in the former Albanian territories still call it Alba and Alban. 228. There seems to be no shadow of doubt therefore regarding the Trojan settlements in Britain, and the same can be claimed for Ireland, with post-Diluvian migrations to then largely deserted areas. This confirms earlier claims to Britain's great antiquity because, according to the Roman legends, Aeneas and other heroes from Troy went to Epirus. So indeed did they, except that the original Epirus, in Hellas, or Greece, was actually that part of Scotland known now as Perthshire and Fifeshire, for Scotland was the original and true Hellas. 229 In the ancient Greece, the Epirus, meaning the mainland as opposed to the Peloponnese, was a wide region bordered in one direction by Aetolia, now the Athole country, and Thessaly, Argyllshire, while Acarnania and Ambracia were to its southeast, Fife, and beyond Acarnania, the Thesprotis region. Stirling, whose Carron River answers to the Acheron. Adjoining Thesprotis, Illyria began, where stood Jerusalem, now Edinburgh. Let us inquire into this further. The earliest arrivals from Troy, who traditionally settled in Thesprotis, were Pyrrhus, son of Achilles, with Andromache, widow of Hector, whom he took to wife. Pyrrhus having died, she wedded Helenus, the prophet son of Priam, high priest and king of Troy, slain by Pyrrhus. They settled in the region of Thesprotis, named Chaonia, which, as will be seen, was the very self-same area of Britain which the Britons and 228 What more, Insulae Britannicae. 229 Further details are given in the riddle of prehistoric Britain and Britain, the key to world history. Romans gave the name of Damnia, both names implying a region at one time suffering from chaos by the act of the deity. Helenus, able to divine the sweet will of Phoebus, meaning that he was an astronomer, especially watching the star Sirius, reigned in the city, probably a fort or a castle, which he built and named Buthrotes or New Troy. It was, says Virgil, a miniature Troy, for there, on a height, he erected his pergamos or fortress, like the original on Mount Ida. The Roman poet describes how Aeneas, after his lengthy voyage which seems to have included Ireland and the whole coastline of Britain, eventually entered the Chaonian port and ascended the city of Buthrotes, accompanied by his son Ascanius. In the third book of the Aeneid he says, skirting Epirus coast, Chaonia's port, that Helenus, Priam's son, over Greeks, bore away, succeeding to the throne and bed of Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus dead, part of this realm to Helenus demised, who, Chaonia's plain by title, New Troy, Chaon called, and built him walls and ramparts on the steep, whose names remind of Pergamus and Troy. In pensive thought, I traced the town, the miniature of Troy, its yellow sunken stream, its fort, surnamed of Pergamus. 230. Chaonia was a fertile country, famed for its oaks and acorns, but it obtained its name because here had occurred fearful destruction from the skies at the time of the great catastrophe, which only the word chaos actually describes. In Chaonia flowed the river Acheron, not the same river as in the western underworld, which rises in Campsie Fells. In classic times the Cyronian mountains lay on the frontier of 230 Virgil, Aeneid, 3, 294, 333-51. Illyria, as the Acheron is the Carron of Stirlingshire. Here, in the Campsie Fells, can be discerned why the region earned the name of Chaos, or the Land of the Damned. Their heights are composed of igneous rocks with sheets of lava. At Dunglass, a meteoritic crater contains the same columnar basalt as found in the Hebridean Sea and Staffa, which points to its formation as of the same period, the impact doubtless causing destruction over a wide area. Stirling Castle, at the other end of the county, is of course the outstanding landmark in these parts, with the river Forth flowing at its foot. Whatever may be said of the claims of London to the name of Trinoventum or New Troy, Stirling, with its ancient foundation and remains, was definitely New Troy in the eyes of the Trojan invaders, who actually called the river Thames. It is surprising how many place names survive all vicissitudes and changes of ownership, and even language. Homer, for example, has for ages puzzled scholars by describing how the Tapians from the coast of Acarnania set sail to Temesa to barter steel, iron, for brass. The Taphii Isles, now submerged, lay off the mouth of the Tay, and the Tapians sailed around Fife, Acarnania, to the Forth or Temesa or Thames, presumably Stirling. Argos Amphiloci, Loch Surrounded, an important town in Acarnania, is probably the present Largo, a very ancient settlement. In Thesprotis, or Chaonia, traditionally congregated many survivors of the Trojan War, and from there, also, did Brutus expel his intrepid brother across the Sea of Ict, or Pict, the North Sea, and became by superior power of arms master of the later Albania or Albion from the Breidabane Mountains to the Solway Firth. Geoffrey of Monmouth gives a colourful but fictitious picture of Brutus' adventures, whereby, as the son of Ascanius, at the age of 15 he killed his parent accidentally with a dart, was driven away by his kinsfolk, and so landed in Britain. That New Troy or Trinoventum lay in the Firth of Forth reveals the need of revision in prehistory and geography, so often deceptive and misleading. It suffices to state at the moment that its true site obtains confirmation from an early Norse Edda, cited by Dr. Waddell, which mentions Tronoi, Stirling, in conjunction with Haydene's Io, Edinburgh, as furnishing warships against the marauding Huns. Its situation is further instructive because Albania geographically adjoined Illyria, and the Alani, or Partheni, were related in an historical sense with Albania, as is confirmed in place names by Allan Water, Bridge of Allan, Strath Allan etc., and the surname of Allan, common in these parts of Scotland. Aeneas, Pyrrhus, Andromache, and Helenus all relate to the era of Troy's overthrow by Agamemnon and his Greeks, a date generally ascribed to circa 1184 BC, but on the evidence of the Golspie stone, confirmed by the Suffolk cycle movement, it occurred nearly 140 years earlier, shortly prior to the flood of Noah, otherwise the Great Catastrophe. For reasons advanced in my prior volume, there are strong grounds for the belief, originated by Jacob Bryant, which attracted wide attention in the late 18th century, that the armament which Agamemnon, king of Argos, from the western Scottish lands, led against Troy, was really an Egypto-Sumerian expedition in which Agamemnon, Aga, a title meaning hero, was actually Sesostris, king of Egypt, whose kingdom may be said to have stretched from Ross-shire in the north to the very south of England west of the Pennine chain, including Wales and much of Ireland. 231 The geography and the period in question can explain why so few of the Homeric heroes were able to return to their original homes, being either shipwrecked or carried away by phenomenal storms. Agamemnon himself, exactly like Sesostris, or King Arthur, and for the same reason, namely the betrayal of his queen by his trusted regent, prematurely returned home, only to be slain. Pyrrhus, however, did reach the Epirus, not so great a journey, from Cuxhaven to the Forth, and yet the son of Achilles. 231 Britain, the key to world history. In his tracts on Troy and associated works, 1795 et seq., Jacob Bryant claimed, largely on the evidence of Diodorus and others, that Homer obtained his history entirely from the Egyptians. He said that Homer got the information from Phantasia, a priestess of Memphis. Bryant considered Agamemnon an Egyptian compound related to Memnon, whose splendid temple at Thebes was called the Memnonium, and where he was styled King of Kings. Egyptian and Greek were largely synonymous in ancient Britain. Made no apparent effort to return to his own possessions in Achaia, situated though it was at the mouth of the Peneus, Loch Linhi, not far distant. Was the reason that his patrimony had been totally destroyed owing to the devastation caused by the path of the comet? The antiquity of Stirling Castle is unknown. It ranks with Dumbarton and Edinburgh as one of the three historic and venerable sites which under the Treaty of Union must be maintained by a garrison. It stands on the summit of an isolated, steep intrusion of basalt, 340 feet above the Forth, and was almost impregnable in past times. Here was the Parliament House, the Royal Palace, the Chapel Royal, now military storerooms, with its powerful defences frowning on the town below and the wide countryside around. It commands the ancient highway from the lowlands to the highlands so that all traffic passed under its walls, making it a fortress of the utmost strategic importance, during the Roman period especially. Its walls were greatly extended and the highway was crossed from east to west by an ancient road between Old Palmas and Dumbarton. The castle was occupied by the Romans, for on the face of the rock below the citadel was found a Latin inscription which stated that the 2nd Legion had built a fort there. The 2nd Legion was associated with Vespasian, and was long connected with this part of Scotland. Such then relates to Troy Noventum. Evidence is forthcoming from antiquarian, archaeological, classical, and traditional sources, supported by place names. Such cannot be ignored, and we therefore see that the original Alba or Albion lay between the Brede Albana Mountains and the Solway Firth, embracing, generally speaking, the territories from the northern border of Perthshire to Cumberland in England, with the exception of Argyllshire and Dumbartonshire, and, further south, the eastern lowlands between Lanark and Dumfries. These Brigantes or Albanians proved their descent from Troy and were justified in claiming that Rome herself is really a daughter of Britain, founded more than 500 years after the first settlers from Phrygia and Troy had arrived. When they went to Italy they took a number of British names with them, such as Regium, in Italy's toe, Umbria, the Humber, Apennines, the Pennines, but they could not transport the underworld Scylla and Charybdis, marine dangers which terrified sailors on either side of the narrow strait between Kintyre and Ireland opposite, for the placid Strait of Messina is a ludicrous claim. Thucydides, in describing the dangers of the channel between Rhegium and Trinacria where lay Scylla and Charybdis, says, "The narrowness of the passage and the strength of the current that pours in from the vast Tyrrhenian and Sicilian mains, have rightly given it a bad reputation." 232 Thucydides, renowned for his careful description and his naval knowledge, could not possibly have been describing the Strait of Messina, Italy, for it would have been preposterous to apply such words to the placid, tideless channel, between Italy and the present Sicily, where there are neither vast Tyrrhenian nor Sicilian main currents entering the strait. Strength of current is entirely foreign to its waters, nor are there any dangerous reefs off either coast to answer to Scylla and Charybdis. The Mediterranean here is practically tideless, and so its waters have augmented and not receded through the centuries, as proved by ancient ruins now partly drowned, and it yet remains placid. The story of Scylla and Charybdis must relate to a totally different region. The explanation is that Rhegium, as shown clearly in this work, was originally Wigtownshire or Galloway in Scotland, and Ireland was originally Sicily, whose earliest inhabitants, as Thucydides says, were Cyclopes, from Orshu, and Laestrygenes, from Norway, on whose islands Minos made war, supposedly because Daedalus fled there from Knossos, but the probable reason was on account of their piratical habits which interfered with the traffic of his ships trading with Gades and other parts in the south. Ireland had many names besides, including Libya, Meropes etc., but as Sicily it is best dealt with in my appendix, b. 232 Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, 4, 24. The vast Tyrrhenian and Sicilian mains, of which Thucydides speaks, was the north channel of the Atlantic which divides the Irish Sea, originally the Tyrrhenian Sea off Cumberland and Lancashire, the home of the Tyrrhene tribe, and the Sicilian, between Fairhead, Ireland, and Kintyre, or Kintyre, leading in from the Atlantic Ocean at both ends. Long before Rome was built, Rhegium was situated, as Wigtownshire is yet, on this strait. In this channel, the murderous sharp basaltic rocks of Fairhead, County Antrim, and the mole of Kintyre opposite, with Rathlin Island's great columnar, cavernous cliffs, just beyond, the adverse currents made these waters perilous indeed. Ancient charts of the Venetians reveal that their ships preferred to sail round the entire Irish coast rather than risk Scylla and Charybdis in this channel, where Ulysses was traditionally shipwrecked and thrown on the shores of Ogygia, probably the Isle Gaia off Kintyre or on the peninsula itself. Scylla and Charybdis were accounted as placed in the underworld, which had nothing to do with the Mediterranean region. If, thus, Thucydides were describing these seas, between Britain and Ireland, it is obvious that in his day the Peloponnesian War among the Greek states took place before they emigrated, if in fact they ever did, other than a comparative few. In the same way that Egypt was a British colony in the south, so must have been such Greek settlements as took place later in those parts. At a later period, between AD 140 to 150, the Brigantes are included by Ptolemy, in his description of Britain. By then their realms extended much further south and included Yorkshire, with such places as Catarac, Cataractonium, Aldborough, Isurium, and York, Eboracum. It is notable that this change seems to have come about at this period because in 136 the Emperor Hadrian had destroyed Jerusalem and driven the Jews away, thus forcibly ending the Jewish state. Their former territory is merely given the name of Gedini by Ptolemy, and he includes no mention of their capital. Does this mean that the Romans, now on friendly terms with the Brigantes, had allowed them to occupy part of what had been Jewish possessions? We must now take stock of the Silures, because in their long struggles against the Romans, the Brigantes had almost invariably been their allies and supporters. They are most vital in realizing past history. Hector Boece, the old Scots historian, gives us one clue to their whereabouts when he claims that Carrick, above Galloway, was part of Siluria. Kyle, called after Coil, king of the Britons, was Silurian, as also Cunningham was the third part and most noisome to the Romans. 233. These three were in what is today Ayrshire, which throws a different outlook upon this people always assumed to have been limited to Wales. This romantic part of Britain, away from the areas of modern factories and the disintegrating hand of commerce, with its hills and dales and wild moorlands, haunted by the genius of Robert Burns, offered exceptional opportunities for guerrilla warfare. The report of Hector Boece, in view of garbled ideas regarding the Silures and their activities against the Romans, is of importance. It denotes how closely the Brigantes and Silures had been associated. We gather from fragmentary reports of Tacitus and Dion Cassius, as also Suetonius, that in AD 45, Britain was in an uproar for harboring refugees, suggesting that they were actively interfering in Britain's internal affairs. 234 The Emperor Claudius decreed an expeditionary force, and with it went Vespasian, who commanded the 2nd Legion. It was under the main command of Plautius. Cunobelin, king of the Cassi, had lately died, and Plautius defeated first Caractacus, and then Togodumnus, sons of Cunobelin, says Dion, whereas Caractacus was his nephew. Dion also states that Claudius led the troops and captured Camulodunum, but Suetonius, who wrote the life of Claudius, says he was in Britain only a few days. 235 The important factor to be noted is that the terrain of the war and after with the Silures and Brigantes was almost entirely in the north, mainly around the Isthmus country, and not in the south at all. For nearly 9 years Caractacus held the Roman forces at bay, inflicted many defeats on them, and the Silures were far from being. 233 Boece, I, 4-5. 234 Suetonius, Vita Claude. 17. 235 Ibid. Nevertheless, Claudius gave himself a magnificent triumph. Vanquished. Julius Caesar's earlier invasion appears to have been in the same direction. Camulodunum was a fortress but was not Cunobelin's capital, which was Trinoventum, the cause of the original dispute in the time of Caecibulon, his grandfather. So whatever else Caesar effected in the north, the Cassi kings had held on to Trinoventum, Stirling, until this time. According to Welsh records, Cunobelin reigned in Britain for 35 years. He was succeeded by his son Guiderius, the Togodumnos of Dion, who was killed in a battle against Claudius in which Caractacus distinguished himself and took over command. Arviragus, the younger son of Cunobelin, subsequently succeeded Caractacus. Caractacus, Caradoc, nephew of Cunobelin, was the son of Bran, brother of the Trinovontini king, who became archdruid of the College of Silures in Mona, Anglesey, according to the Welsh accounts. In 36, Bran resigned the Silurian crown to Caractacus, and, on the death of Guiderius, although Arviragus should have been his brother Guiderius' successor, Caractacus was unanimously elected to the Pendragonate or Supreme Military Command of the Northern Celts, a Scottish title for the Supreme Command, on which occasion Arviragus voted in his favour and served under him. 236. Later, when Caractacus was defeated and taken prisoner in the Ordovices country, Lanarkshire, the Silures elected Arviragus in his stead, and as Tacitus admits, in Britain, after the capture of Caractacus, the Romans were repeatedly put to the rout by the single state of the Silures alone, under the leadership of Arviragus. 237 To whom the poet Spenser pays tribute. Never king more highly magnified, nor dread of Romans was than Arvirage. 236 Webb, Glastonbury pp 23-4. In the Welsh triads, Arviragus is accused of having later betrayed Caractacus. 237 Tacitus, Annals, I, 250, 294. The fact that first Caractacus and then Arviragus were given the Pendragonate stamps the northern conduct of his war, for Pendragon was a military title, mentioned in the Book of Iona, and records that Arthur was the son of Pendragon. What was the character of the Claudian invasion? We have evidence of Vespasian in Wiltshire about Stonehenge and in the West Country about Bristol, yet we hear nothing of the northern or eastern parts. What inference may we draw from Seneca, who was the contemporary of Claudius, and who knew something about Britain, for an ancient manuscript in the Bodleian Library of Oxford is said to contain letters between St. Paul and Seneca relating to the apostles' residence in Siluria. I ask what reference, because Seneca wrote these lines. Il Britannos ultra noti. Littera ponti. Et coeria eos scuda brigantos. Der Romulis calla catenis. ISC 238. Truly we must grant poets their license, but unless Seneca implies that Claudius was enslaving the Britons in the north, beyond the shores of the known sea, as well as his reference to the Brigantes in the north, his words are meaningless. Yet Claudius certainly did make such claims, declared that they had conquered the Orkneys and on the strength of it named his son Britannicus. Claudius was succeeded by Ostorius. He had trouble with the Iceni, probably in Lincolnshire or Norfolk, and then marched against the Cangi or Ciangai in North Wales, but when nearly opposite the High Hernian Sea he had to turn northwards to the Brigantes where civil war had broken out. More trouble lay in store. The restless Silures, whom neither harshness nor clemency could soften, as Tacitus observes, were becoming increasingly active and dangerous. 238 He condemned the Britons beyond the known seas and the Brigantes with blue shields to give their necks to Roman fetters. Possibly derived from Seneca's Apocolocyntosis, a satire on the deification of Claudius. It was then that Ostorius, so that he may be the more at liberty to erect forts amongst them, for their repression, that the Roman colony at Camulodunum was formed with army veterans in that part of Britain already conquered, as a check to rebels there, and to keep the allies to their obligations. 239. These are suggestive words, when appreciated. Camulodunum, as will be proved without dispute a little later, lay in the region between the Forth and the Clyde, straddling the isthmus. Note Tacitus' claim that it had already been conquered. By whom and when? It was the region of the rebels, and who were they? The Silures, admittedly, but whom did they represent? Modern writers on this period, completely losing the wood for the trees, seek vainly in the wrong surroundings. Generally Camulodunum is regarded as in Essex, confusing it with Camulodunum in the Antonine Iter, which some say was Colchester and others Saffron Walden. But what interest had the Silures, hailing from the north, in the region of Essex? Others attempt to locate it in Wales or nearby, as at Camerton in Somerset, but that fails completely to fit in with the situation of this tribe who were fighting in the north. Ostorius, as we see, had put this colonia in the care of army veterans, his aims being primarily to control the Silures. As he only accomplished his purpose in 50 AD, in the intervening years these people had been carrying on a successful guerrilla war. The colonia of Camulodunum became in fact the focal point in subsequent warfare. Camulodunum has also been frequently confused with the capital of the Trinovants, because it was not far distant. In view of what has previously been advanced, in which Stirling has been identified with the original Trinovantum, with Camulodunum at Scottish Camelon, near Falkirk, historians have blundered badly in placing them in the region of Essex. For example, Caractacus, finally defeated in a battle against the Romans on Silurian soil, fled to the adjoining territory of the Ordovices, who also adjoined the Brigantes, and whose queen Cartismandua sold him to the enemy. 239 Tacitus, Annals, I, 250, 294. Cartismandua betrays Caractacus. The Ordovices country was the present Lanarkshire, where, according to Ptolemy, they had a fort or town named Branaginium. Ravennas, whose chorographia of British towns was compiled early in the 6th century, places this fort near Magnes with others along the Antonine Wall from the Clyde to the Forth, which confirms the fact that the Ordovices dwelled in that region. Magnes has been identified along the Vallum as Bar Hill, a strong fortress in its day. All these traces take us to the Isthmus region. Caractacus, betrayed thus in the 9th year of the Britannic War, had performed many bold deeds which caused him to become preeminent, not only in his own country, but with the Romans. His long defiance captivated the minds of a people who lived under a stern dictatorship, and Claudius, exhibiting him and his family before the Romans in a triumphal procession, added to his own glory, which proves how greatly interested were the Romans in events affecting Britain. Caractacus stood dignified and unmoved in the tribunal, and in a noble speech claimed to be descended from illustrious ancestors who governed many nations, contrasting the emperor's fortune with his own. He and his family were pardoned and were covered with praises and favors. 240 His daughter Gladys was adopted by Claudius and assumed his family name of Claudia. She later married the young Roman senator Rufus Pudentius, who had large possessions. Both became Christian. St. Paul, in his farewell letter to Timothy, sends greetings to Pudens, Linus, and Claudia. Where had they met before, if not in Britain? Ostorius found that the removal of Caractacus did not lessen the activities of the Silures but in fact made them the more determined for revenge under Arviragus. Orders for the construction of forts near Camulodunum were unsuccessful, for the commander of the camp and his legionaries were surrounded and nearly annihilated. The commander and 8 of his centurions as well as a number of other men were lost. The Silures also intercepted 2 auxiliary cohorts and by liberal division of the spoils gained the support of other tribes. As a result, says Tacitus, Ostorius died, weary of these defeats. 241. Aulus Didius, who succeeded Ostorius, found the Silures anything but humbled. They overthrew a legion and were displaying great activity, as were also the neighboring Brigantes, and were fighting among themselves. Claudius died in 64, in Didius' second year, and Seneca alludes to a temple dedicated to the emperor in Britain, where the natives worshipped him as a god. 242 This temple was erected at Camulodunum where the Romans tried to enforce their deification of Claudius upon the Silures, and this more than all else drove them into a frenzy of rage and indignation. Meanwhile the Silures held the Romans at bay until 61 when Nero bestowed the governorship upon Suetonius Paulinus. This general first of all prepared to attack Mona, the sacred Druid island well fortified just off the mainland, with many Druidic groves, his object being to overthrow the Druids, who, however, with Druidesses, faced the Roman soldiers. The Druidesses, carrying torches, ran around, we are told, like furies, while the Druids uttered fearful imprecations. 240 Tacitus, Annals, 12, 36-7. 241 Tacitus, Annals, 12, 38. 242 Seneca. Lud de mort Claude. The attempt to force the Silures to deify Claudius was the cause of violent rebellion, and raised their hands towards the skies. They were apparently massacred, but whatever the Roman chief's intentions were with regard to Mona, his plans were interrupted by news of the sudden uprising of Boadicea, queen of the Iceni, and her allies. As Tacitus comments, laconically, the Britons had suddenly revolted. Boadicea's late husband, King Prasutagus, had left his 2 daughters to the care of Caesar whom he made his heir, hoping thus to keep his kingdom and his family free from injury. It was not to be. It throws a lurid light on the Romans that they not only abused their trust, but beat the queen, violated her daughters, and seized the estates of the principal Iceni. Where they dwelt is uncertain but they were probably in Norfolk and the adjoining lands. Tacitus says that they entered into a secret compact with the Trinovants and some others motivated by great bitterness towards the veterans. These were expelling folks from their homes in the new colony of Camulodunum, seizing their lands and calling them captives and slaves, being supported by the army. 243. Nor was this all. The temple which had been erected to Claudius where he had been deified was, says Tacitus, a further cause of violent hatred, and the enemy, the Britons, prepared to make the colony an easy prey as it had not been enclosed within walls. Many prodigies inflamed the popular mind, and without apparent cause the image of the goddess Victoria fell and looked backwards as if going over to give victory to the Britons. The estuary of the Thamesis reflected the colony overturned, the ocean had a bloody tinge and apparitions of dead men were left behind by the receding tide. The storm burst with unbridled slaughter and destruction of the Romans, where the aged and the women sought refuge in the temple which was carried by assault in 2 days. Pedilius Ceriolus, legate of the 9th Legion, who later was prominent in the siege of Jerusalem, marched to the relief, but was routed with the loss of all his foot soldiers. 244. 243 Tacitus, Annals, 14, 32. 244 Tacitus, Annals, 14, 32. All this is interpreted as having taken place in Essex, and it will be noted that the Tamesis is recorded, or supposed to have been recorded, in the Annals. Also Tacitus says that Suetonius hurriedly left Mona and passing boldly through the enemy reached Londinium, but his meagre following, as well as news of the defeat of Cerealis, decided him to abandon the town. 245 Though he forced the populace, including women and children, to march with the troops, and those who failed were massacred. The same slaughter, he says, took place at Verulamium. Considerable reservation must be made in regard to the correctness of these two statements. To begin with, if Suetonius were marching towards Camulodunum where the uprising occurred, why should he have marched boldly through the enemy? There is no record of any rebellion in the Midland counties through which he would pass. Secondly, this word Londinium appears to be an interpolation for Trinoventum. Thirdly, while there might have been trouble at Verulamium, there was another and very important Verulamium in Fifeshire, namely the present town of Dunfermline, a most ancient city and former birthplace and capital of early Scottish kings. Fourthly, the word Tamesis was not in the original. Phelps, the well-known historian of Somerset, says that Tamesis is a later interpolation and does not occur in the MS copy in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, nor in three others cited by the Rev. John Skinner, former rector of Camerton, near Bath. 246 Someone had a motive for this dishonest piece of deception, to lead the reader away from the true scent. Further doubt as to the accuracy of the region is aroused by the subsequent account of Tacitus to the effect that when Suetonius, with some 10,000 legionaries, reached the scene of the disturbance and battle, the Britons had brought their wives in wagons to the outskirts of the field of battle to witness the struggle, and that Boadicea, with her daughters, stood in a chariot and harangued each tribe as it arrived. Such an assembly was the custom of the 245 Ibid, 14, 33. 246 Rev. W. Phelps, History and Antiquities of Somerset, I, p. 145. Tacitus adds that Boadicea poisoned herself, but Dion Cassius on the contrary asserts that she collected an army of 230,000, died a natural death, and was honourably interred. Caledonians. That it extended to the south of England is not acceptable, but the injured queen and her daughters might well have been present at this battlefield in the north. The account, which says that the Britons were annihilated and that the Roman losses were only about 400 killed and wounded, is also questionable. 247. Indeed, the defeat could scarcely have been so overwhelming, for Tacitus admits that, with the army placed in winter quarters, preparations were made for continuing the war. 8 cohorts of auxiliaries and 1,000 horse were sent from Germany and 2,000 legionary troops to fill up the losses in the 9th Legion. Moreover, the Britons made no submission, and it was reported to Nero that the end of the war could not be expected until Suetonius was superseded, which after a short inquiry was brought about. 248 These events tend to nullify the supposed overwhelming victory of Suetonius, and a guerrilla war continued on a wide scale until in 69, Vitellius, during his brief imperatorship, sent Vettius Bolanus to replace Suetonius. It is very strange that there appear to be no Roman records of military movements in Britain from 62 until 71, but there are a few sidelights. In 66 Nero sent Vespasian from Rome to pacify the Jews of Jerusalem and Galilee, but in 69 he left Titus to defeat the Jewish rebels, whose raids and aggressions had made them a menace to Roman interests. Vespasian went himself to Alexandria to watch events during Vitellius' imperatorship. In the intervening struggle between the Roman leaders, we are told that the soldiers in Britain favoured Vitellius against Galba and Otho, but on Vespasian's proclamation the 2nd Legion and others espoused his cause. 249. In the year 71, Jerusalem fell to Titus. In 70, we are informed that, with the triumph of Vespasian, the Britons, otherwise the Silures or 247 Tacitus, Annals, 14, 34-7. 248 Ibid, 14:38. 249 Tacitus, Histories, 3:44-70. Jews, found their hopes reduced. The Brigantes, for one, caused much trouble, and Petilius Ceriolus, now made propraetor or governor by Vespasian, fought many bloody battles with them, but Pliny, significantly, remarks of this period that nearly 30 years after the Claudian invasion the Roman army had only extended their knowledge of the country to the vicinity of the Silva Caledonii and not beyond. 250. In other words, they had not conquered beyond Stirling. An interesting sidelight shed on these events, including the Jews, is contained in the career of Petilius Ceriolus, whom we hear of first in 62, as commanding the 9th Legion, so heavily defeated at Camulodunum. In 66, when Vespasian landed to pacify Jewish unrest, wars, and plundering, Ceriolus served under him as legate of the 5th Legion. In 69, when the Romans began the siege of Jerusalem, Ceriolus was present, and in 70 was entrusted by Titus with the formidable task of storming the Tower Antonia, and the Temple. 251. After the fall of that city, Ceriolus was sent for a short time to Batavia, Holland, to defeat the Germans who were troublesome, and in 71 Vespasian made him governor of Britain. 252. In these circumstances, seeing that Ceriolus was consistently, from at least 62, in the vicinity of Britain, could he simultaneously have been active at the other end of the civilized world, where Jerusalem is supposed to have stood? As a matter of fact, he remained in Britain until 75, for we are told that Frontinus succeeded him and subdued the Silures, whose valor and difficult country had hitherto been insurmountable. 253. In this research I must touch on Agricola, who took over the command in 78. Shortly before his arrival the boasted Roman victories could not have been so overwhelming after all, for the Ordovices, in Lanark, nearly annihilated a body of cavalry. And 250 Pliny, Natural History, 4:30. 251 Josephus, Wars, 6:2-5. 252 Ibid, 7:4-2. 253 Tacitus, Agricola, 1617. Gave new hopes to others. Most of his first year was spent in conciliating the province, probably Judea. Evidently he was in the region of the Forth and Clyde, for in 80, new nations were opened up, and the country was wasted as far as the Tay. Later, garrisons were placed in forts along the isthmus. Despite his victory over the Caledons, the northern conquests of Agricola were of no permanent value. Having reached this point in the sequence of events, it is advisable to look further into the question of the situation of Camulodunum, which played so important a part in the war, as a strategic point, from the time of Claudius to that of Suetonius. It was on the showing of Tacitus a camp and a colony built either in the territories of the Silures or near to them. Ostorius first formed it as a check to rebels in conjunction with forts to keep them in their place and force them to perform their obligations. 254 In view of the tribes involved, it could not have been anywhere near Essex, or as some have claimed, at Gloucester or in Somerset, the latter surmise based on the incorrect assumption that the Silures were confined to South Wales, for which there is not a vestige of evidence. The Colonia of Camulodunum, the fortress of the Camulls or Campbells, pronounced Camels, stood near the site of the present town of Falkirk, 25 miles west of Edinburgh. It is known to the Scots as Camelon and associated, as so many outstanding places are in that neighbourhood, including Arthur's Seat, with King Arthur, the British hero of prehistoric times. Camelon or Camelodunum, was the place where Ostorius, as Tacitus states, first founded his colony of veteran, trained, soldiers, to give stability to the Roman arms in that region, and those overbearing methods roused the Britons nearby to insurrection. The fort of Camulodunum, uncovered by General Roy in the 19th century, commanded the Forth and Clyde Isthmus when it was erected, about midway between the two extremes of water. It was near to the Brigantes, and also the Silures in the region of 254 Tacitus, Annals, 12:32. Edinburgh. This fortress was built on an elevated plateau of considerable size to which the colony area was added later. Subsequently the fortress was linked up with a series of fortifications along the vallum, or wall, attributed to Agricola in 79, and later yet to Lollius Urbicus, 138-9, who erected another wall of turf with some stone, soon after the death of Hadrian, known as the Antonine Wall, after Antonius Pius, or Graham's Dyke. Camulodunum was brought into close contact with the vallum and its nearby forts by later additions impinging on the earlier British fortress. A causeway originally connecting the fortress with the vallum now lies some 9 feet below ground, under Kincardine moss. Dion Cassius describes it as the capital of Cunobelin, which is doubtful, for his capital appears to have been Trinoventum, Stirling. Ostorius captured it from Cunobelin's successors, presumably from Caractacus, and Tacitus informs us that in order to contend with the Silures, the Colonia was formed with Roman veterans as a check to further rebels. 255 There a temple was erected to Claudius, where the Romans tried to force the natives to worship him as a god, which maddened them to revolt. 256 At Camulodunum the colony was identified by the foundations of buildings and the usual offices, it being only protected by a turf wall. Which confirms Tacitus. There is a site in the center of the area which General Roy suggested was occupied by the temple. The general was an archaeologist who devoted himself to identifying the antiquities of Camulodunum, as described by Miss Jessie Mothersole in her work, Roman Scotland. MacDonald, who examined the site towards the end of the 19th century, stated that Camulodunum possessed solid stone edifices, a praetorium, a palace, and baths, employed tiles for roofing and floors, used Samian ware, possessed bronze and enameled fibulae, and various weapons. Among other finds were coins from Vespasian to Marcus Aurelius. One stone is engraved with the 20th. 255 Tacitus, Annals, 12, 32. 256 Seneca Lud de Mort Claude. It is also mentioned by Tacitus and Dion. It was also called Colonia Claudia, Gordon Home, Early London, p. 178. Legion, who recovered the city after its seizure by the Britons. 257 Pedilius Cerealis dubbed the 14th Legion Domitores Britannicae, conquerors of the Britons, after their exertions at Camulodunum in 61. 258 The 20th were engaged in holding the Antonine Wall later, and bore the word Victrix on their standards after recovery of the fortress, a possible reference to the feud which arose relative to the statue of Victoria, the Victrix, and the Temple of Claudius. Camulodunum is one of the outstanding clues to Britain's history under the Romans. Let us not overlook, moreover, in coming to a final understanding of these activities, that, as Edinburgh was the real and existing Jerusalem of that period, the furious anger and indignation of the people is entirely in accordance with their character and excitement when there was any question over the statue representing the goddess of victory, to say nothing of the attempt to force them to worship Claudius as a god. As the Caledonians and Highlanders worshipped Apollo and Hermes and probably other Olympian deities, it would not excite them to such a degree, but since the Silures and Jews were one and the same, the turmoil and massacre could be understood. At the time when this uprising reached its greatest height in 61, there seemed to the Britons a possible chance of throwing the Romans out altogether. When Suetonius, after wasting valuable time, was advancing by forced marches, the Silures and their allies may have thought they could hold Camulodunum against him. Cerealis had been routed. Suetonius, approaching, had with him the 14th Legion and the veterans of the 20th as well as other auxiliaries. 259 There can be no doubt as to the site, vestiges of which survive at Falkirk, where the River Carron washes its eastern flank, one of the most important remains of the vicissitudes of early Britain. This being proven, we may wash our hands of the supposed arena of all this activity in the south and east of what is now England, and 257 Tacitus Annals, 14, 34-7. 258 Tacitus, Histories, 2, 11. v. 16. 259 Tacitus, Annals, 14, 34. Perhaps intelligent students will have the courage to revise their estimates of these events which throw a lurid light on Britain's past, a past which someone was desirous of concealing by tampering with the original work of Tacitus. On the other hand, we can reconstruct true events from the surrounding topography. We may visualize the magnitude of the struggle at the time, centered around the borders of the Forth and Clyde, where Boadicea had gathered together a large army of Iceni. Was Trinoventum the fortress city which Suetonius abandoned when he decided to await a more favorable opportunity? Moreover, as Londinium could not have had anything to do with this warfare, may we not interpret it as another interpolation by a scribe at a later date? In like manner we may solve the mystery of Verulamium's location, because the Catuolani, or Catuolani, placed in Lincolnshire by modern writers, have left no evidence or sign whatever of this. On the other hand, we can place them with some confidence in Fifeshire, their neighbours to the south being the Cornabii, where we find the name Abercorn to this day. The Catuolani beyond possessed two towns noted by Ptolemy, Salini and Eurolanian. 260 we find the Saline Hills and Saline in Fife, and Eurolanian corresponds with the Viramo of Ravennas, the ancient city of Dunfermline, once the Scottish capital. Therefore, on this evidence, the struggle had nothing whatever to do with eastern England except for the Iceni who moved north to ally themselves with the Britons fighting Rome. Having thus identified Camulodunum, I must now turn to Caerleon, the capital of the Silures, who, as we have seen, were really in the van of the never-ending struggle in the north. The name Caerleon signifies the city of the lion, but the lion was never a symbol of the Welsh. The dragon is the Welsh insignia, likewise the daffodil, but never the lion, which was, as all are aware, the Scottish emblem, as also of Norway. It was the most ancient emblem of the Cassi, Catti, Cad or Gad tribe, and gives an indication of origin we cannot. 260 What more, Insuli Britannicae. Eurolamian or Verulamian are merely variations of Verulamium, the one Greek, the other Roman. Ignore. 261 There is also another strong objection to the alleged site of the city of the legions, as it was frequently described, for Caerleon was thus situated in the center of long and continuous uprisings and disturbances which compelled strong military forces to be stationed amongst them, hence the reference to legions. This would not apply to Wales on the farther side of the Severn. Indications in fact point to its definite location in the north. The Emperor Severus divided the island into two parts, superior, upper, and inferior, lower, and we learn from Dion that the 2nd and 20th legions were placed in Upper Britain, the 2nd stationed at Caerleon, the 20th at Chester. Canon Rain considers that the boundary line lay between the Humber and the Mersey. 262 A time-honoured division, for it seems to have been the line of demarcation in the time of Belinus and Brennus. Thus we must seek Caerleon elsewhere than in Wales, and beyond Chester. Thomas Gale, the famous antiquarian of the 17th century, writing of Ermine Street, the Great North Road, and its antiquities, states that the street that leads from London to Caerleon was called Hermine Street, the name being of Mercury, formerly Hermes, the god who was concerned with roads over which he presided. 263 It passed through Catterick, Yorkshire, where was a shrine to the god of the roads, to Corstopatum, Corbridge, on the Tyne, in present-day Northumberland, and, passing over the Tyne wall at the Devil's Causeway, crossed the Cheviots into Roxburghshire, the original Ottadini country. Thence it arrived where Edinburgh now stands. Henry of Huntingdon also states that Ermine Street ran from north to south. 264. 261 Waddell Phoenician origins etc. He demonstrates clearly that the Cassi, Catti, or Gad, all variants of the great aboriginal ruling race or clan, were the people of the cat, namely the lion, their national emblem. They originated from the Shetland Orkney Isles, and northern Scotland. Moses selected Gad above all the other tribes for his praise in Deuteronomy 33:20, 22, He dwelleth as a lion, and teareth the arm with the crown of the head, indicating the heraldic lion rampant with right forearm upraised. He characterizes Dan and Judah as the lion's whelps, younger branches of the old lion. The Caledonian and Norse use the same emblem as does Shetland. Denmark and Edinburgh answered to the whelps. 262 Rain, York, p. 13. 263 Watmore, Insulae Britannicae. 264 Ibid, p. 148. Thus may we establish where Caerleon really stood. It was the city of the Lion of Judah. It was Jerusalem, a name forbidden after AD 136. It heir 12 of Antonius from Moridunum to Uroconium, or Viroconium, in the Cornaei country, lists it as Isxa. Leg 2 Augusta, and in the same itinerary are such names as Bovium, also Bulium, Buli being the name of an Illyrian town, Gorbanium, Govan, Magnes, Bar Hill, and Uroconium, the modern Abercorn, north of Edinburgh, all pointing to the one direction in the region of the Roman wall across the isthmus. Isxa Leg 2 Augusta was the August city on the river Esk, the Roman Isxa. 265 Ravennas also describes it as Isxa Augusta, and mentions it in connection with Unno, or Hinnom, the chalky area, identified with Falkirk, from the Greek word alpha lambda omicron, white. Ravenna's place is Banya, Croy Hill, on the wall, next to Isxa Augusta. That these pointed to Edinburgh is unmistakable. The deliberate destruction of Jerusalem by Hadrian in AD 136 has to be borne in mind. We possess a vivid description of 7th century Caerleon by Geraldus Cambrensis, who speaks of its remains and former magnificence. He mentions splendid palaces with golden roofs, its temple ruins, and the ruins of a gigantic tower, probably a reference to He Tower of Antonia, erected by Herod the Great to protect the temple, and thrown down or left collapsed at the foot of the hill of Moriah where it had stood. He mentions a theatre, a vaulted tower, and aqueducts. The castle, he states, also lay in a ruined condition. These references are easily accountable in relation to Jerusalem, with its temple overthrown, its great adjoining tower in ruins, its castle destroyed, its former aqueducts, for water supply, for which Jerusalem was famed, and the remains of previous magnificence and splendid palaces, all accord with the city of the Lion, where Edinburgh stands today, but in no possible manner can it be associated with the insignificant site, position, or antiquarian. 265 Legion II, so proudly connected with Caerleon, was Vespasian's own legion, closely involved in the capture of Jerusalem. Remains of the supposed Caerleon, near Cardiff, which in no respect matches the description of Geraldus. Mainly occupied by fields and orchards, there exists a mound, 30 square feet at its base, and only 30 feet in height, said to have been originally a watchtower. In what is claimed as the Round Table Field of King Arthur are the remains of a small Roman amphitheatre. The walls here are 12 feet in thickness. There are also the remains of a castle or fort overlooking the river Usk. It is a poor substitute and covers a small acreage. It was doubtless a Roman station, but never the great Caerleon. Geraldus also speaks of Caerleon being built, or rebuilt, by Roman princes and adorned with stately edifices. He specially mentions the baths, subterranean buildings within and without the walls, the aqueducts and stoves which diffused their warmth through imperceptible pores, but not a vestige of any such luxuries or works has ever been discovered at the so-called Caerleon, and not so much as a foundation of walls or of subterranean buildings. All these remains of a great city, with a large population, as was Jerusalem, and immense wealth which the Romans so greatly envied, apply to Edinburgh but are entirely alien to this small military camp and provincial township in South Wales. What, moreover, of Caerleon's cathedral church and its bishop or archbishop? Here is surely a matter for inquiry. As mentioned previously, Pope Sylvester I, at the behest of Constantine, summoned 3 British prelates to the Council of Alls in 314, namely York, London and Caerleon. Canterbury was far later, showing thereby recognition of 3 most important British cities which could claim bishoprics. Would there be a bishopric without a church? That such churches existed in York and London is well known, but the remains of Caerleon in Wales show no such foundation, unaccountable had such existed. In addition, only a few miles away stands Llandaff Cathedral, which claims to be the first Christian church in Wales, and if the principality were entitled to a bishopric in 314, its proper site would have been Llandaff. What of Edinburgh? Its history admittedly is very veiled in the first few centuries after Christ. It became Christian evidently before the reign of Constantine, or its bishop would not have been cited to alls. St. Giles Cathedral, Edinburgh, was erected, as I sought to prove in my second volume, on the former site of the original temple of Herod, as, indeed, is exactly where the earliest Christians sought to erect their church, namely on the site of a former pagan fane. St. Giles is undoubtedly one of the oldest existing edifices in Edinburgh, for archaeologists agree that from the earliest known times a church stood on the present site. It was largely destroyed by Richard II of England, who left it almost a ruin when he burnt most of the ancient city, but it was restored shortly after. It is, be it noted, the church of the most noble the Knights of the Thistle, as to which, be it recalled, the thistle was another of Jerusalem's emblems, and is borne on her coins. In view of the evidence produced, the Silures were definitely in this region, and we have convincing proof that Caerleon was the early Edinburgh, formerly Jerusalem, a name forbidden by Hadrian when he expelled the Jews from that city and area. As also will be shown shortly, after Jerusalem had been largely destroyed by Hadrian in 136, which was a century and 3/4 before the Council of Alls, there was ample time for the original Jerusalem to have become Christian, as was in fact the case. It can be well understood that the new pope, and presumably, in view of his Romanising policy, also Constantine, who mattered greatly, was anxious to obtain the homage of the Church in the former Jerusalem, by then named Caerleon, although whether that prelate attended the council is not found on record. It appears accordingly, as it has been the endeavour to show by the masses of evidence so far brought to bear on the subject, that the wars of the Romans against the Britons were with few exceptions waged in the north, in those regions anciently a part of Greece, where we trace the first Trojans, and were against Caledonian, Pict and Scot, with the Atticodi a menace in Dumbartonshire, and the Illyrians or Silurians adjoining them in the neighbouring Lothians. This demands some explanatory reference to the invasions of 55 to 54 BC by Caesar, who took up the cause of Mandubradius of Trinoventum, whose father the king had been slain by Cassibellaun. Caesar's marches from where he supposedly landed in Kent have always been confused and contradictory. Trinoventum, as shown, lay in the north. His aim was to defeat Cassibellaun, the leading Caledonian or Pictish monarch, and thus to bring Scotland to heel. If, as Tacitus states, Caesar were the first invader of Britain, the problem arises as to what the Roman historian actually intended by the name of Britain. If he included the territories in the south, how is it that Lucan, referring to Caesar's disordered retreat, uses the words in sarcastic vein, "The agitated wave disappoints the Caledonian Britons"? Unda Caledonios fallit turbida, 266. What explanation again can be given of the words of Sidonius Apollinaris, who writes, "Caesar bore his victorious standards even among the Caledonian Britons and routed the Scot, Saxon and Pict." 267. Surely Sidonius, a writer of distinction, was not frivolously romancing when he, like Lucan, connects Caesar with Scotland. Hector Boece, in the early 16th century, in Historiae Scotorum, wrote thus of Caesar. "It is said in our vulgar, public, chronicles that Julius Caesar came to the Calendar Wood and cast down Camelon, the principal city of the Picts after the same was rendered to him, whilst he left behind him, not far from Caron, a round house of square stones, 24 cubits broad, to be a memory of his coming to the place." 268. Boethius, Hector Boece, however, adds albeit unwillingly that as no other famed authors mention Caesar's war with the Picts and Scots, he will let it pass, but the round house of Julius, without windows above, like the ancient Roman temples, was also said to have been built by Vespasian for Claudius and was cut down by Edward I. It seems to relate to the temple erected at Camulodunum. When we consider the description of the Britons as contained in Caesar's Gallic War, it must be said that it applied far more to the 266 Lucan, Pharsalia, 6, 68. 267 Sidonius Apollinaris, Letters. 268 Boes Hist Scot, I, 4. Northern Britons than to those in the south. They produced, he says, a great number of cattle and lived mostly on milk and flesh, and wore clothes made of skins. He stresses that they stained their bodies blue with woad, or, as Silenus remarks of the north, tattooed themselves with the figures of animals, which was why the Caledonians were called Picts, from Picti, painted ones. Caesar also expressly mentions that 10 or 12 men shared wives in common, notably a Caledonian custom. 269 Not Caesar alone, but Diodorus, Strabo, Mela, and Silenus, as well as Tacitus, all appear to have had Scotland solely in mind when they mentioned the Britons. Caesar's description of his first landing where high hills ran up to the water's edge scarcely applies to the coast of Kent, mainly flat, where he is supposed to have landed. In his campaign against Cassabellon, with the capture of Trinoventum his main objective, could only have related to the region of Stirling, so important a centre if the invader wished to capture those parts. The south had been mastered long before, and this explains how Pompey could have marched through York to Edinburgh, known by their biblical names, without appearing to relate in any way to Britain. As a matter of fact, the Bible, supported by Josephus, regarded as a history, discounting the dogma of the Jewish rabbis which leads most students astray, gives us largely the history of Britain from the earliest times to the period of the Babylonian captivity. Josephus takes us to AD 70. 269 Belgal, v. 14. Chapter 10. The True Jerusalem and the False. The Jerusalem of modern times is not the city of the Scriptures. Mount Calvary, now nearly in the center of the city, was without the walls at the time of the crucifixion. And the greater part of Mount Zion, which is now without, was within the ancient city. The holy places are for the most part the fanciful dreams of monkish enthusiasts, to increase the veneration of the pilgrims. Rev. J. P. Lawson. It is a curious fact that after the crushing defeat of the Jews in AD 70 by Titus, as a province under the aegis of Rome, there is little or nothing of outstanding importance to relate of Britain for the next 50 years. It does not signify, however, that in the absence of Roman reports everything was beautifully peaceful. From 83 onwards, Agricola, with a considerable and well-appointed army, as well as a Roman fleet, pushed his conquests northwards, and in 84 he gained a great victory over the Caledonians, led by their chieftain Galgacus, who in a rousing speech to his forces, including many charioteers, emphasized the greed of the Romans and how defeated opponents were made slaves. Despite Agricola's victory, his conquests were not destined to be permanent. Except that the Brigantes caused occasional trouble, the dogs of war were apparently sleeping. Yet trouble on a big scale was brewing. About 120 to 1, Hadrian, 117 to 138, one of the most popular and efficient of Roman emperors, visited Britain, adjusting many things there, says Spartianus, his biographer. What he was adjusting was to erect a wall, murum, primus duxit, 80 miles long, to separate the barbarians from the Romans. 270 It may be inferred that Hadrian personally inspected the site of the wall or barrier when completed. Spartianus preserves some verses sent to the emperor by the poet Florus, in which he says, "I wish not to be Caesar, to walk through the Britons, to endure Scythian frosts." 271. Poetic license, it is true, might use such a term as Scythian frosts without necessarily MLPing Caesar's visit to Scotland, but it would scarcely include the imaginary building of a wall 80 miles in length. Where was this wall? The Roman wall between Tynemouth and the Solway Firth is wrongly called Hadrian's Wall to this day, for as Watmore points out, the Tyne Wall was not erected before the reign of the Emperor Severus in the 3rd century AD, although certain forts may have been raised earlier. In any case, its length is only 68 miles, 12 miles short of that mentioned by Spartianus, and 12 miles of wall are not to be ignored. The wall of Severus is not, moreover, mentioned in any Roman record before the Notitia, circa 400. The other wall, the Antonine, or Graham's Dyke, is 32 miles overall, and that was only reconstructed in the reign of Antonius Pius, Hadrian's successor. Thus we must search elsewhere. Watmore, in his Insulae Britannicae, appears to have solved the mystery of the third wall, which he identifies with the Catrail, a lengthy earthwork which survives in places immediately across the border from the junction of the rivers Liddel and Esk, and thence northward in the direction of the Forth, possibly to Kinyle, Pont Ely. Watmore proposes its start from Leith, the port of Edinburgh, and estimates its overall length at about 80 miles. 272 Whether it began at Leith, or as some think at Kinyle, it explains Hadrian's wall in more ways than one. The Gadini are placed by 270 Spartianus, Hadrianus, 51. 271 Ibid Hadrian penned a verse to Florus in return, saying, I wish not to be Florus, to walk taverns, to endure biting gnats. 272 Watmore, Insulae Britannicae. Ptolemy as occupying just that area, and the name Catrail survives as a variation of Gad. Whether it commenced at Kinyle or Leith, it must have bounded the ancient city, and it descended southwards along the Gala water to Galashiels, Selkirk, and Haywick, to end on the confines of Dumfries and Cumberland. The intention was evidently to pin the bellicose or Jews behind the barrier. Watmore, however, does not appear to have had the slightest idea that the unrest which caused Hadrian in 120 to 121 to rail off the Silures, was concerned with the Jews of Jerusalem. This Catrail or trench, about 20 feet wide, and now only about 3 or 4 feet in height, has the excavated earth piled on the slopes on which it abuts. It starts from Borthwick Water at its southern end, goes northwards via Galashiels, where clear traces of the rail survive, as also at Selkirk. The name rail suggests a barrier to the Cat or Gad tribe, the name preserved at Jedburgh, Gad, Gade River, Cadrum Barn, Gadeamun, and Cat Castle, Stone House. Waddell describes it as an earthwork rampart and trench or ditch, extending from near the Pentland Hills to the Cheviots, separating Berwick from Strathclyde, but he does not venture any opinion as to why this was carried out. It yet mystifies archaeologists. The answer may be sought in Spartian's report, to divide the barbarians from the Romans. The use of the name Gad suggests that the Silures were supported by Scottish tribes across the isthmus. There can be little doubt that Hadrian for many years was harassed by increasing opposition from the Jews and their allies. Gibbon writes on this aspect of the period in question. From the reign of Nero to that of Antonius Pius, the Jews discovered a fierce impatience with the dominion of Rome, which repeatedly broke out in the most furious massacres and insurrections. The enthusiasm of the Jews was supported by the opinion that it was unlawful for them to pay taxes to an idolatrous master, and that a conquering Messiah would soon arise, destined to break their fetters, and to invest the favorites of heaven with the empire of the earth. It was by announcing himself as their long expected deliverer, and by calling on all the descendants of Abraham to assert the hope of Israel, that the famous Bar Chachibus collected a formidable army with which he resisted during 2 years the power of the Emperor Hadrian. 273. Simon, son of the Star. Reports of these preparations by those given terms a race of fanatics induced Hadrian to settle a Roman colony in Jerusalem and brought the revolt to a head. In 134 the banner of the Messiah was raised with resounding tumult. Portents were seen in the sky, and the clouds were anxiously watched for the glory which would deliver them from their persecutors, as had happened before in their 273 Edward Gibbon, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, I. 16. Tacitus, in Histories, 4, 54, states that in the year 70 a diet of Druids assembled somewhere in Britain and foretold the ultimate empire of the Celts. It was the same year in which Titus besieged and took Jerusalem. History. 274 Bar Kocheba, son of the Star, was acclaimed as the Messiah. Miracles were ascribed to him, flames were seen to issue from his mouth, excited multitudes flocked to his standard, and the whole Jewish nation was in violent convulsion. The heights about Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives and others, were fortified. The hysterical enthusiasm with which the Jews flocked to the standard of the impostor shows how easy it was to delude them with his messianic belief, supported by their priests, or druids. The chief rabbi, Akiba, declared that the prophecy of Balaam, "A star shall arise out of Jacob," was accomplished, publicly anointed Bar Kochba king of the Jews and placed a crown upon his head, after which, he followed him to the field at the head of 24,000 horsemen, in the capacity of his master of the horse. 275 Finally, coins were minted bearing the inscription, "First year of the redemption," the reverse adorned with the insignia of the Scottish thistle for luck. Bar Kochba shekel/tetradrachm. Temple with rising star. Shimon. Thistle. To the freedom of Jerusalem. For 2 years the indomitable Jews held the Romans at bay by means of guerrilla warfare. Finally, they were besieged at Bathers, a strongly fortified position on a mountain not far from Jerusalem, and utterly defeated. According to Dion, in this terrible war 580,000 Jews were cut off by the sword, besides an infinite number in addition who perished by famine, disease, or fire. 276 Bathers, the site. 274 Britain, the key to world history. Hezekiah, the first Messiah, the righteous king, was so regarded because in his reign the invading Goths, or Gog and Magog, were destroyed by a blast. 275 W.T. Doan, Bible Myths, Resonance BW. 276 Hisram, Gibbon, I. 15. Of this disaster, searched for in vain in the Palestine of today, may be identified with some confidence as the Nock, a once strongly fortified camp, towering 1,007 feet in height at Bathgate, 19 miles from Edinburgh. Jerusalem, as a city, suffered the extreme penalty, again to quote Gibbon. The Romans, exasperated by the Jews' repeated rebellions, exercised the rights of victory with unusual vigor. The emperor founded under the name of Aelia Capitolina a new city, to which he gave the privileges of a colony, and denouncing the severest penalties against any of the Jewish people who should dare to approach its precincts, he fixed a vigilant garrison of a Roman cohort to enforce the execution of his orders. 277. In the Story of the Nations series, Hosmer describes the aftermath. Bar Kochba, whom many Jews believed to be the Messiah, headed a revolt put down by the Emperor Hadrian. The taking of his stronghold Bathers was the coup de grace. Palestine was utterly devastated, the land full of graves, the market with slaves, the towns given over to wolves and hyenas. Even the name of Jerusalem was lost. A pagan city, Aelia Capitolina, rose upon its site. A temple to Jupiter stood upon Mount Zion, about which was gathered a population of Roman veterans, of Greeks, Phoenicians, and Syrians. No Jew could enter the city, under pain of death. 278. The writer is not entirely correct. That wolves and hyenas prowled about is probably a fiction, and the temple of Herod, on whose site was erected one to Jupiter, was not on Mount Zion, which was the citadel, but on Mount Moriah. What happened in reality was that Hadrian caused the temple to be razed to the ground. The Tower of Antonia, built by Herod, adjoining the temple, was also thrown down in a heap. The palace or castle on the adjoining hill was largely destroyed, and the city walls were demolished. The very name of Jerusalem became taboo, and it was named Aelia. 277 Hisram, Gibbon, I. 15. 278 James K. Hosmer, The Jews, p. 133. Capitolina after Aelius, the first name of Hadrian, but as such it did not survive, yet it may still be traced in Kinile, Cian, kin, or kin, a head, or point, eel, Aelia, by Bonus, originally Pont Aelii, at the extremity of the Antonine Wall, the boundary in the north of Hadrian's new city. Jews were forbidden to enter the city or approach it, and those who did were condemned to death, except for one day yearly when they might view it from the extremity of the Mount of Olives, King Arthur's seat. Only one way lay open for Jews to dwell in the former holy city, and that was by the adoption of Christianity. The Nazarenes, a highly religious Jewish sect, adopted the Christian faith, elected Marcus, a Gentile, as their bishop, and at his persuasion the most part of the congregation renounced the Mosaic law and thereby acquired admission to the new colonia of Hadrian. 279 In view of these facts, it may now be realized why Hadrian, after this final dangerous rebellion against Roman domination, which was suppressed with difficulty, erected a rail, or barrier, to prevent the Jews from returning to their former capital. The action of the emperor has been stigmatized by writers as harsh, but the Roman viewpoint deserves consideration. For some 200 years, the suzerain power had experienced periodic uprisings with these intractable people who firmly believed themselves to be the chosen race, superior to all others, according to their prophet Moses. The Romans were extremely tolerant to all religions before they adopted Christianity, and if the Jews placed faith in their Jehovah they did not interfere. On the other hand, when they refused to pay their tribute or taxes because their religion forbade recognition of any Gentile ruler, the Romans regarded it as akin to anarchy, so they eliminated them as a nation and expelled them from their sacred city. As we have seen, the Jews had been subversive to Roman power as far back as the reign of Herod the Great, who had to maintain a 279 Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History, I. 3, 5. Difficult equilibrium by keeping in with Rome in the time of Augustus and also maintaining his prestige with his Jewish subjects. The building of his temple was to curry favor with his subjects, but he alienated them by adorning its eastern facade with an enormous golden eagle, the insignia of Rome. This aroused violent hostility among the priests, and others. As suggested earlier, Herod's building of Caesarea at such expense for Augustus was his method of compromise to avoid a critical situation. The Jews, in Hadrian's reign, made long and secret preparations to finally expel the Romans. Hadrian must have been aware of this, for he had evidently visited the region himself. Dion Cassius tells us that in the year 131 Julius Severus, the emperor's leading general, was given the command to defeat the Jews. 280 Historians, quite misled, imagine that he was recalled from Britain at this crucial period, and sent against the Jews at the other extremity of the ancient world. Such is a complete error. He had been sent to Britain specially by Hadrian, because of the evident growing unrest and preparation for war by the Jews. Hadrian himself is known to have visited Eboracum or Cea's area on at least one occasion, possibly more. Ptolemy, who completed his description of Britain circa 140, shortly after the war in Hadrian's time, gives the name Gadini to the region of Edinburgh but omits the mention of any city or town in it, a most unusual omission on his part. Watmore, however, culls something about its name, without suspecting the inner significance. In the Triads of the 6th century, he says, Sinon mab Clydno Edon, Sinon, son of Clydno of Edinburgh, was slain at the Battle of Cattraeth, Catterick. The victor, King Ida, the Saxon, joined Dingaith, Dinah's city, Gwath or Gad, to Bernishnisha, Northumberland. In 685, Brudii, king of the Picts, expelled the Saxons from Guthlangaran or Gidial Guarth, which city the Venerable Bede called City Giadai. 281 Furthermore, Penda, king of Mercia, lay at the city of Jadu. 280 Dio Cassius, LXIX, 13. 281 Watmore, Insuli Britannicae. Before the Battle of Gai Campi, the same city, which Ravenna terms Igidanska in the 3rd century, a combination of Judin and Esk or Isksa, the river of Edinburgh. 282 In the 4th century when Vortigern, a usurper, ruled in these parts, he is described by Geoffrey of Monmouth as Earl of the Gewissi, Jews. He involved himself in a war with the Picts and the people of Albany, and in dire straits appealed to the Angles of Scandinavian descent to aid him. In 449, Hengist and Horsa crossed the sea in their long ships and began the series of invasions from Danish sources. Hengist helped Vortigern to defeat the Picts on the other side of the Valum or wall, and the Gewissi nobles gave him the land for the castle of Caer Cori, which appears to refer to Castle Cary, an important sector of the wall, and a powerful fortress. This is much more the likely site of Hengist's castle than the supposed one at Doncaster. All these names, Gad, Giadai or Gidi, Judan, Ijidanska, and Jwisi, appear as memories of Edinburgh's original name, as a variation of Caerleon, the city of the lion. Nor should we omit to recall the classic references which placed the city of Jerusalem in Illyria. As was examined in my previous volume, Abraham, and Lot, who migrated south from Ur of the Chaldees with their Hebrew followers, were identical with the classic Cadmus and Cilix, who went from Samothrace to Hebron, or under its Greek name, Cadmeian Thebes, the first city of the Hebrews in the south. The day came when these Israelites were driven out of the land of Canaan, migrated to the city of the Jebusites, which they accorded the name of Jerusalem, and captured it. 283 The Greek legend told that the Cadmeians, expelled from their country of Thebes, the biblical Hebron, settled among the Anchiales in Illyria. 284 This tradition supports a Greek myth whereby Cadmus, crushed by the doom inflicted upon his city of Thebes, retired among the Anchiales or Anchileans of Illyria, where his son Illyrius was born. The name Illyrius occurs in another myth in which the 282 Ravennas, Choreographia. 283 Britain, The Key to World History, Resonance BW. 284 Herodotus, v. 61. Similarly, the Israelites were expelled from Hebron, Avabari, in the 7th year of David's reign. Cyclops Polyphemus had 3 sons by Galatea, otherwise Rhea Cybele, consort of the deity Kronos, who were named Celtis, Gallus and, the youngest, Illyrius. Polyphemus here seems to be a synonym for Abram or Cadmus, who otherwise appears as Galates to the goddess Galatea. More simply put, the Cadmeians regarded Abram or Cadmus as their patriarch, the founder of the Celtic or Gallic nation, and later that of Illyria, who were the Jews. Follow this to its logical conclusion. If Illyrius, born in Illyria, were the later-born son of Cadmus, or of his race and blood, for such legends must not be interpreted too literally, and if Cadmus were Abram, the implication is that there arose the later kingdom of Judea, and that another name for them, that is Illyrius, Illyrians, is simply a Greek variation of Siluria or Silurians. It has been seen, moreover, that adjoining the Edinburgh region lay the original Epirus, and that Illyria, placed in conjunction with Albania or Albany, is correct historically and geographically, and hence that, as with other ancient sites and place names, we have been misled. The Silures, although mainly concentrated in the regions about Edinburgh, were also prominent in Wales, the Midlands, Wiltshire, Somerset, and Cornwall, for in those parts dwelt the Galileans and Edomians or Edomites. As Tacitus says, the Silures, from their colored faces and plaited hair, were supposed to have sprung from a colony of the ancient Iberi, otherwise Hebrews. The original Illyria is alluded to, albeit vaguely, in a few passages that assist to establish its position. Pausanias, who describes how the Illyrians defeated the people of the Epirus, avers that red water, red as blood, may be seen in the land of the Hebrews near the city of Joppa. 285 St. Paul's epistle to the Romans states, "From Jerusalem and round about into Illyricum I have preached the gospel of Christ." Romans 15:19, unless the two were closely connected, his allusion is meaningless. There can be little doubt that the apostle was prominent in spreading the gospel from Edinburgh and its surrounding regions. An ancient MS in the Bodleian Library, previously mentioned, is said to contain 285 Pausanias, Periages, 4, 35, 5-9. Letters between Paul and Seneca, relating to the former's residence in Siluria, which may be translated to Edinburgh. 286. All the foregoing evidence both as to site and place names directs an unerring finger to Edinburgh. One further sidelight on its geographical position is worth consideration. When the Jews returned after the captivity in Babylon to Jerusalem, by permission of Cyrus, and began to erect Zerubbabel's temple and the city walls, the Samaritans and others who had suffered under Judean tyranny in the past, complained to Artaxerxes, Cambyses, and asked that the old records should be searched, when it would be proved to have been a seditious city, and if rebuilt thou shalt have no portion this side of the river. The king of Persia had the search made, and in consequence stopped all building. He sent word. It is found that this city of old time hath made insurrections against kings. There have been mighty kings also over Jerusalem, which ruled over all countries beyond the river, and toll, tribute, and custom was paid unto them. Ezra 4, 16, 19-20, a further indication of the river Perath, Euphrates, is given in the plea of Nehemiah, then in Susa, to the king of Persia, when he asked, "If it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over until I come into Judah." Nehemiah 2, 7. Such a request indicates something very different to the mere ferrying of a visitor across a river, even if a broad one. It suggests not only totally different conditions on the other side, but that a voyage across this river had to be arranged. In other words, it was a sea, a strait, or gulf, for which the word river was applied, as pointed out earlier. It is described in the book of Judith as the Great Strait of Judea. 3, 9. This apparent fact needed little stressing. All that need be said is that all such references are alien to the river in the Middle East termed Euphrates, which lies some 650 miles east of Jerusalem across the Arabian desert. Yet, as the texts show, Jerusalem lay on or near the sea. Solomon, we recall, reigned over all the kings. 286 Britain, the key to world history, Resonance BW. From Perath to the land of the Philistines, to the border of Egypt. 2 Chronicles 9, 26, 287. He was one of the mighty kings to whom Artaxerxes probably referred. To return, however, to the period of 132-6, in the reign of Hadrian, Jerusalem was no longer permitted to continue under its former regime. Its name was changed and it was forgotten, and thus it continued for over 2 centuries. Its very site and history had passed from men's minds as such, perhaps not so surprising, considering that no literature or history on the subject existed. But if we glance at the other side of the picture, namely that Caerleon, the city of the lion, had come to the fore as one of the 3 important cities which at the time of the Council of Alls had possessed 15 bishops after Marcus, the first to occupy the episcopal bench, it clarifies much. Nevertheless, some parts of the reconstructed city must have for long lain in ruins, as described in the 7th century by Geraldus Cambrensis, and from all that is known of the stern, unbending character of the Edinburgh citizens throughout their history, they took their religion very bitterly, like some nauseous drug, essential but unpleasant and leaving dour effects. They became Christians of the Essene or Nazarene persuasion, a severe faith based on the Mosaic cult rather than the Roman Church, which later leaned heavily to the Pauline doctrine. It was a characteristic which it might justly be claimed led far later to the violence shown to Queen Mary Stuart and to the savage bigotry of the Covenanters, who indeed might well be considered as chips off the old block with their fanatical destruction of all on which they could set eyes as idolatrous, while John Knox himself was a second Jeremiah. Edinburgh seems to have borne as many names as York through the ages, originally Jerusalem or Mount Agneth, then Elia, subsequently Caerleon, and finally Eden, or Odin, otherwise Moses. How it acquired. 287 Jeremiah, 13:4-7, also refers to Perath as a body of sea water with a shore of rocks within easy access of Jerusalem. The latter name has never been satisfactorily resolved, but the Norsemen in early days called it Hades Io, which may be interpreted as the Eye of Odin. Traditionally, the Scandinavians believed that the Eye of Odin, as expressed in the Edda, roamed over the whole world and saw all things. And his 2 ravens, Hugin, mind, and Munin, memory, sat on his shoulders every eve and whispered in his ears the world's tidings and events. In my previous work I endeavored to show that Odin was the same teacher or leader as Moses, which is confirmed in many directions. 288 And in Odin's never-closing eye, the city of the Jews, which had so determinately worshipped that remarkable man's nebulous deity Jehovah, was, one might say, the apple of his eye, Odin's city. This view is necessarily conjectural, but it explains the name whereby Odin's or Moses' city was so termed the Eye of Odin. In any case, its antiquity was profound, and hence we find Gildas, the monkish historian, son of the king of Dumbarton or Alcluth, describing it as Caer Eden, civitate antiquissima, a most ancient state. Whatever the actual relationship of Constantine the Great with Britain, his father Constantius died in York in 306 when preparing for a new expedition against the Britons of the north. He would be acquainted with the growth of Christianity in Britain and would not have been totally ignorant of the past history of Caerleon, as Edinburgh was evidently known in his lifetime. His mother, according to British traditions, was a British princess, daughter of King Seal of Colchester, and Constantine was at least partly brought up in Britain. He was certainly in York when his father died, and 2 years later made a claim to a share of the empire, received the title of Augustus, and became master of the countries beyond the Alps, including, of course, the British Isles. 4 years later he defeated his rival, Maxentius, who was drowned in the Tiber. It was in this campaign that Constantine was said to have recognized Christianity as his faith, and to have gained victory under the sign of the cross. Subsequently he became sole dictator of the Roman Empire, and for reasons known to himself caused Jerusalem to be discovered with other alleged biblical sites in the present Israel. It is incredible that this 288 Britain, the key to world history, Resonance BW. Great Emperor, with his background, could be unaware of Jerusalem's past history and of its obliteration by Hadrian. If he had strong reasons for wishing to transfer the early sites of Christianity to the Near East, making Constantinople the center of his empire, there was little opposition to fear from any quarter, especially when a most drastic censorship was placed on any writings which may be inconvenient. He was thus able, with coadjutors, to dump it down in the Near East, although it probably never entered his head that his act of deception would successfully fool the world for a period of over 1,600 years. The fact remains that, for over 2 centuries, while Christianity steadily increased in numbers in the north, Jerusalem itself became completely forgotten, so much so as an incident reveals that, when a martyr in Diocletian's reign said that he came from Jerusalem, its name was unrecognized, and that was only some 70 years after its destruction. Human memories of events are short, in most instances, regarding the past, and especially was this so when books or writings were scarce, and few could read. History could only be preserved in the form of a myth or a legend. How long Constantine took in making his preparations to waft Jerusalem and the Holy Land from their true sites to the parts situated so conveniently for his new capital Constantinople is not known, but in 326 he dispatched his mother, the Empress Helena, on a mission to the New Jerusalem to discover the sacred sites. Helena, by that time an aged woman, was an ardent Christian. Her son supplied her with ample funds, and history records that high ecclesiastical personages had been advised to escort her and assist her to discover the exact spots where Jesus had been born, crucified and buried. Her especial task was to find the true cross. On the authority of Saint Cyril, who was present, this actual cross was unearthed at Mount Calvary, lying deep in the soil, along with 2 others identified as those of the malefactors crucified at the same time as Christ. It certainly needs consummate faith to accept these miraculous finds. According to Eusebius, Ambrose, Chrysostom and other ecclesiastics of the period, Helena divined the spot thus miraculously and discovered the Holy Sepulchre, also the inscription which had been affixed to the cross of Jesus, and even the actual nails that had pierced his body. The Empress thereupon caused the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be erected on this sacred spot, and the other 2 crosses were set up in churches devoted to the Nativity and the Crucifixion. 289 These discoveries followed shortly on the Council of Nicaea in 325, at which Constantine decreed formally that the Christian religion was in future to be that of the whole Roman Empire, whereby complete doctrinal power was placed in Roman hands. Many historians have suggested that it was an astute political move on the part of Constantine, for in so doing he deposed the god Mithra, who had been installed as the chief deity by Maximian. Mithra was now deposed and Christ reigned in heaven in his stead. As the result of the Empress Helena's pilgrimage, and with stirring accounts of other miraculous happenings, the New Jerusalem began to attract pious Christian pilgrims and before very long, under imperial patronage, it prospered. Julian in 361, however, became undisputed master of the empire and, although brought up as a Christian, he devoted himself to Greek literature and philosophy, abandoned Christianity and avowed himself a follower of Mithra instead. In 363, just before he was slain in battle against the Persians, he gave the Jews permission to rebuild their temple, in Jerusalem. A curious event happened. The foundations had been laid, the building was about to commence, and all was in readiness, when a severe earthquake destroyed all the work thus far completed. The Christians regarded this as the warning hand of the deity and showed distinct hostility towards further effort on the site, and so it was abandoned. Justinian in the 6th century was more a lawyer than anything else. He erected, however, a magnificent church dedicated to the Blessed Virgin, and it was claimed that it possessed the original holy vessels from the Jewish temple, said to have been recovered by Belisarius, his general, who overthrew the Vandals in Africa and the Goths in Italy. 289 Socrates Scholasticus, Ecclesiastical History, I. 13. The subsequent history of this Jerusalem is not at all distinguished. In 614 the Persians took the city by assault and sacked it thoroughly. The churches of Constantine, of Helena, and of Justinian, were gravely damaged. All the wealth obtained from pilgrims was seized and the supposed true cross taken away into Persia. Again, in 634, the famous Omar became caliph of the Arabs and captured Jerusalem from the Christians, who, however, were permitted to dwell there. He selected the supposed site of Solomon's temple for his mosque to Mohammed, as it is at present. Needless to add, it was never the site of Solomon's, or Herod's, temple. Jerusalem became deserted for a while even by pilgrims except for the few whose fervor and enthusiasm overcame all obstacles, although for their part the Muslims even welcomed them, not because of their faith, but because of their contributions. At the time of the First Crusade in 1099, the city had a wall but only contained 3 gates, named St. Stephen's, David, and Olafé, although at the time of the destruction of the original Jerusalem, it boasted no fewer than 23 gates and 3 walls. Thus, through the centuries, the artificial creation of Constantine and his coadjutors continued, its upkeep assisted by Christian pilgrims and the succession of crusades, where many pious men laid down their lives in the belief that it was to recapture for Christianity the holy city where the Savior had lived and died for the sins of mankind. The Crusaders were of course innocent of any knowledge of the deception played on them back in the 4th century. How should they have known? It is doubtful if many of the priests were aware of the facts. Peter the Hermit, for example, who, by his courageous agitation, aroused the conscience of Christendom to the situation. It might be questioned whether even the popes of a later period were themselves acquainted with this pious fraud. Yet we must recall that Gregory the Great, 590–604, not only showed great desire to bring the British Christians into the Roman fold but especially earmarked York and Caerleon as archbishoprics directly they adopted the Roman form of faith. We remember that in the year 600, St. Augustine, then at Canterbury, wrote informing Pope Gregory that Christianity began in Britain, a letter still recorded, but it evoked no response in the pontiff's bosom, as might be expected. Possibly, therefore, the Pope knew the true facts and only wanted to have others forget such inconvenient matters. Gregory I was the most powerful of the early popes, more so than even any Roman emperor, for he controlled the souls as well as the bodies of the civilized world. As the archprelate he lived sumptuously and was said to possess over 1,000 slaves to do his bidding. Jerusalem was described by Jeremiah as the perfection of beauty and the jewel of the whole earth. Lamentations 2:15, it certainly does not apply to the city so named in the East, which is today much as it was in the past. It is a shabby, shapeless, provincial type of city of narrow streets and filthy bazaars, and possesses no real antiquities other than a few from late Roman times. It is built on a height, and is surrounded by rugged hills, with a stony, forbidding soil. It has had through the centuries no commerce or manufacturers worthy of mention, and no minerals except potash in the Dead Sea. Most of the country is composed of barren limestone mountains, with only a few streams, which mainly dry up in the summer, and with few areas able to grow produce. Jerusalem's port of Jaffa, named after the original Joppa, is a poor harbor and lies 35 miles from the capital, reached over forbidding hills. From a topographical aspect, the present site of Jerusalem in Israel fails in every single particular to correspond with the famous city so minutely described by Josephus and in only slightly lesser degree by Nehemiah. As far back as 1640, the German traveler Quartet, after a careful examination of the principal sites, declared that it failed in every respect to coincide with the Jerusalem of Josephus and the scriptures. Claims to the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, said to be concealed under a mosque in the town of Hebron, are unsupported by a grain of evidence, as also is the so-called Hebron itself, which verily lay not 12 miles from Jerusalem but over 400, as indicated earlier. The rock-cut sepulchres of the kings in the valleys called Jehoshaphat and Hinnom are of late Roman age with Greek inscriptions, and the actual sepulchres of David, Solomon, Hezekiah, and other of the kings were buried in secret vaults beneath the original city of David or in the citadel itself, Edinburgh Castle. 17th century Edinburgh, showing the castle. Holler. Mount Calvary, scene of the crucifixion itself, lay in the direction of Mount Hinnom and was some 4 miles outside the walls, whereas the place selected as the Holy Sepulchre is falsely sited inside the city. Mount Zion, where David built his palace or castle and called it the city or citadel of David, was part of the city, whereas the alleged site is placed outside it. Moreover, it was the highest point in the west, facing the Mount of Olives in the east, and from the long rising hill at the foot of the mount, a straight street led steadily upwards to the hill, or Mount Moriah, where stood the temple. There the hill was broken by a ravine, but it continued as Mount Ophel to Mount Zion itself. Not one of these landmarks can be traced in Israel, and it would, indeed, be difficult to find two sites more utterly at variance. 290. The real Jerusalem stretched mainly from west, city of David, to east, to the Palace of Lebanon and the Garden of Gethsemane, on the flank of the Mount of Olives. It was a long narrow city with another hill south of the High or Street of God, and later with Bezatha, the new. 290 Lawson, Scripture Gazetteer, 2, p. 163, the Jerusalem of modern times is not the city of the Scriptures etc., as quoted at the beginning of the chapter. City, a suburb on its north, adjoining the Pool of Bethesda. The Asiatic Jerusalem is erected on a hill, is square and squat rather than long and narrow, with Mount Zion at its very south instead of in the west where it stood, and the Mount of Olives consisting of 4 not very high hills, whereas the original Mount of Olives dominated Jerusalem as King Arthur's seat dominates Edinburgh. 291. Many modern visitors have realized how completely the present so-called Jerusalem fails to correspond with the detailed description given by Josephus in his Wars of the Jews, and as he was the Jewish general who opposed Vespasian in 69, when he was taken prisoner, he knew the topography of the city as well as any man. Nothing in the Jerusalem of today can be related to the early Jewish era, and its oldest archaeological remains are only late Roman. Nor does it end there. Nothing in the groups of ruins at Petra, Sebast, Baalbek, Palmyra, or Damascus, or among the stone cities of the Haran, is pre-Roman. Both clerics and laymen have expressed doubts regarding the authenticity of Jerusalem and other sites for, although inhabited cities may make many changes, the physical conformation of a region cannot completely transform itself, as in the case of Jerusalem, and adopt an entirely different arrangement throughout. I append a sprightly commentary from the pen of Stephen Graham, a well-known author who happened to be also an Edinburgh man, and who represented the average intelligent outlook on the subject. Jerusalem, the earthly, is a pleasure ground for wealthy sightseers, a place where every stone has been commercialized, either by tourist agencies or greedy monks, where the very candles lit by the pious before the pictures and the shrines are put out the moment they are lit and sold in sheaves to the Jews. The first thought of the true pilgrim on looking at Jerusalem was expressed by a peasant who said to me as we were listening to the shrieking populace at the Holy Sepulchre on Palm Sunday, "This is not Jerusalem." Scores of times I overheard such words as it's all knavery and the miracle of receiving the holy fire is all a fraud. The monks put a chemical. 291 Josephus, Wars, v. 5, 1. Powder in a cleft of the stone, and when the sun gets warm enough the powder bursts into flame of its own account like phosphorus. It pays the monks to have the miracle, thousands of rubles are paid to look on it. It has been sacked and destroyed as many times as ancient Rome, and ever, over the debris, some people build it up again. The skeptical aver that no one knows exactly where the ancient Jerusalem stood and that localization and identification of the holy places are so much pious fraud. Jerusalem is built high up, the mountains do not stand round about it. At points it is higher than in the center. There are the 4 hills, Olivet, but they are not much higher than the rest of the town, as the Calton Hill, Edinburgh, is above Prince's Street. 292. Despite the fact that the modern Jew has only in very rare cases any of the blood of ancient Judah, the belief persists that Israel is the ancient home of the Jewish people, and the ancient conflict carries on there, by proxy. 292 Stephen Graham, with the Russian pilgrims to Jerusalem, pp 13-5, 57, 105. Chapter 11. Suppression. Science ntia non habet inimicum praeter ignorantum. Francis Bacon. The final issue now requires careful and unbiased consideration based on the evidence which has been produced in the earlier pages, as well as in the 2 preceding volumes of this trilogy, exhibiting in detail how and why it has been possible for the